Welcome to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I'm K.M. Weiland, and I am here to take you deep with story theory, writing techniques, and the incredible wisdom of story. I believe story is the greatest power on this earth, and that as writers, we carry the torch of wielding that power with responsibility, passion, and skill. There's no such thing as just a story. Today, it is my honor and my purpose to help you write your best story, astound the world, and maybe change your life. Hello and welcome. You are listening to The Secrets of Story Structure, Part 10, the third plot point. The third act begins with another life-changing plot point. More than any preceding it, this plot point sets the protagonist's feet on the path toward the final conflict in the climax. From here, your clattering dominoes form a straight line as your protagonist hurtles toward an inevitable confrontation with the antagonistic force. Because the entire third act is full of big and important scenes, this opening plot point, by comparison, can sometimes seem less defined than the first plot point and the midpoint. However, its thrust must be just as adamant. The third plot point represents a low moment for your characters. The thing they want most in the world will be almost within grasp, only to be dashed away, causing them to question their investment in the conflict. The subsequent climax will be the period in which the characters rise from the ashes, ready to do battle from a place of inner wholeness. The third plot point is the place from which they must rise. As the portal between the second act's end and the third act's beginning, the third plot point represents one of the story's most significant shifts. Back at the 25% mark, the transition between the first and second acts signaled that the characters had left behind their normal world, and with it, whoever they used to be. Now, this bookending transition into the third act signals they have entered the final proving ground. Everything they have learned, experienced, gained, and lost in the second act will be put to the final test. Symbolically, within the transformational arc of a story, the third plot point represents death, with the possibility of rebirth if the character manages to complete a positive change arc. Often, this beat is referred to as the dark night of the soul, indicating an intense period of internal suffering and questioning as the characters grapple with external losses while struggling to unify all the pieces of their newly evolved selves. If they can successfully manage this, they will be able to embrace the story's thematic truth and rise into a new version of themselves, one with the capability to achieve moral and perhaps practical victory in the climax. If they fail this intense test and cannot fully rebirth into a more coherent version of themselves, they will struggle to find a complete victory in the climax. This weakness may cause them to lose the plot goal altogether. And even if they manage to seize the plot goal, perhaps through dubious means, they will experience a fatal moral failure that poisons their achievements. The intensity of the character's suffering at the third plot point will depend on the nature of your story. Generally, whatever takes place here should be the worst thing that has ever happened within the scope of the story. For example, in Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins, the vigilante Ra's al Ghul announces his intentions to destroy Gotham, then burns Bruce Wayne's mansion and leaves him for dead. In Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Jane discovers on her wedding day that Mr. Rochester is already married to a madwoman. This prompts her to flee her life at Thornfield, ending her relationship with the man she loves. And in Charles Portis's True Grit, young Maddie finds her father's murderer and is captured by a gang of outlaws who threaten her life. The symbolism of death is important and can be used literally. The characters may lose a loved one or perhaps even suffer significant injuries themselves. The death may also be metaphoric. Perhaps they experience the death of a career or a relationship. This symbolism can emerge subtly through cues in the exterior setting that reflect the character's inner questioning. For example, perhaps they pass a funeral or observe a crushed flower, on the sidewalk. It is important that the characters face the death of the person they used to be. The challenge here is whether or not they will embrace this death and claim the subsequent rebirth. The third plot point is made up of two important beats. The thematically crucial low moment is preceded by the equally important false victory. One of the most significant features of this pairing is that it creates a natural arc to the beat. It begins in a seemingly positive state before plunging the characters into darkness. I talk about this in more detail in my book, Next Level Plot Structure. Even more significant is that this pairing creates the bridge between the action phase of the second act into the full-on transformation of the third act. Throughout the second act, particularly after the midpoint, the characters have been rapidly progressing in their ability to understand the nature of both the internal and external conflict. Thanks to the moment of truth at the midpoint, they recognized the potency of the story's central truth and began integrating it into both their internal landscape and their tactics in the external plot. But there's a catch. Even though the characters claimed the truth at the midpoint, they have not yet fully rejected the lie. Throughout the second half of the second act, they continued to cling to certain of their old limited perspectives from the first act. More than that, as they became more and more proactive toward the end of the second half, they failed to see their blind spots, and this leads them directly to the false victory at the beginning of the third plot point. Whatever happens here is the result of a tactic the characters deliberately employed to reach their goal. They may have believed this gambit was the one that would finally lead them to success. Even if they were back on their heels and making a desperate choice, they acted according to everything they learned up to this point, but without realizing they have yet to fully face their blind spots. And this leads them to the low moment. In some stories, the false victory will be only a short moment of hope before everything falls apart. Even in stories in which the false victory is truly victorious in some way, the characters will suffer collateral damage. Sacrifices will be made, sometimes willingly, but usually because the characters' choices create dire consequences. This will lead them to their soul searching, and if they successfully transform, the complete death of their old lie and complete rebirth into the new truth. For example, in What About Bob, the protagonist Bob shows clear signs of improving his neuroses, but this leads directly to the mental breakdown of his psychiatrist Leo, which prompts Leo's family to ask their friend Bob to leave. In Toy Story, Woody is on the brink of escaping from Sid's room back to Andy's house, only to have his plans thwarted when the rest of Andy's toys see Buzz's dismembered arm and believe Woody has hurt him once again. And in A Christmas Carol, Scrooge joins the third and final spirit, having been much changed by his previous visitations, only to be shown a doomed future that includes his own death and that of Tiny Tim. The third plot point takes place at the 75% mark. Like the first plot point's threshold between the first and second acts, the third plot point creates a threshold between the second and third acts. It is not properly a part of either act, but provides the portal between them. Timing becomes trickier the closer you get to the end. In longer works, such as novels, it can be easy to get carried away in the second act, but this can sometimes cramp the third plot point. Alternately, in shorter works, such as films, we can often see an overemphasis on the climax that ends up shortchanging either the third plot point's low moment or trying to get it over with as early as the second pinch point at the 62% mark. Although timing and pacing are never hard and fast propositions, it is important to evaluate the big picture of your story's structural timing. Assess whether any structural sections are getting shortchanged, particularly when it comes to the transformational beats, the first plot point, the midpoint, and the third plot point. Ensure they receive the spotlight they deserve. The events of the third plot point may create a lengthy sequence comprising the first half of the third act, leading right up to the climax. There's much for the characters to experience and react to in this beat, all of which lay the groundwork for their ability to take definitive conflict-ending action in the climax. In action stories, most character arc adjustments should be completed before the climax begins. In more relational stories, the climactic moment may be the character's final decision about how to act upon the story's truth. Regardless, the third plot point and subsequent scenes must be fully developed to provide a sound foundation for the story's ending. All right, let's look at our examples of the third plot point from film and literature. Pride and Prejudice. Just as Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy begin to grow closer while spending time at his Pemberley estate, word comes that Elizabeth's youngest sister Lydia has run away with the scoundrel Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth must return home, not only fearing the worst for her sister and her family, but also believing Lydia's scandalous actions have caused Mr. Darcy to revile her family forever. It's a Wonderful Life. After looking everywhere for the money Uncle Billy lost, George is forced to his lowest point when he approaches his nemesis, Mr. Potter, for a loan. When he offers his life insurance policy as collateral, Potter scoffs, "Why, you're worth more dead than alive." George sinks into soul-wrenching desperation as he drives to the river and contemplates killing himself so the policy can be cashed to repay the money. Ender's Game. Ender is forced into a fatal confrontation with the bully Bonzo. In a display of the ruthlessness that has made him so successful at battle school, he kills Bonzo. He is devastated by his actions and nearly gives up on battle school, fleeing to his family on Earth to contemplate who he is becoming. And Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World. This film provides an example of a low moment timed to take place at the second pinch point, as Captain Jack Aubrey's best friend, Dr. Stephen Maturin, is accidentally shot aboard ship. For the first time, Jack abandons his obsessive pursuit of the French privateer and takes his friend to the Galapagos Islands so he can be safely operated upon. The later turning point into the third act occurs when the Acheron is sighted nearby, setting up the final confrontation. This is not a low moment for Jack, but still sketches the beat's emotions by being told through Stephen's perspective and showing his disappointment that he will now have to abandon his long-awaited expedition to the Galapagos. And here are the top things to remember about the third plot point. Number 1, the third plot point occurs at the 75% mark, providing a bridge between the second and third acts. Number 2, the third plot point may be an utter upheaval of the gains the characters thought they made in the second half of the second act, as in Pride and Prejudice. It could be an unexpected event, as in It's a Wonderful Life, a personal decision, as in Ender's Game, or a meeting between protagonist and antagonist, as in Master and Commander. The third plot point begins with a false victory, in which the characters use what they learned in the second act to try to gain the plot goal. They may experience a win or just the expectation of one. Number 4, the low moment follows on the heels of the false victory and prompts the characters into deep soul searching as they contemplate their choices and actions. And number 5, if the characters can successfully see through their blind spots to reach the story's central thematic truth, they can rise back up to definitively approach the plot goal in the climax. The third plot point proves how far your characters have come on their personal journeys and whether they can integrate everything they've learned. The climax is coming up next, and they will need to consolidate all their growth to reach their plot goal. So stay tuned, because next week, you guessed it, we will talk about the climax. And in the meantime, I hope you'll stop by the blog, leave a comment, and talk to me about this. What happens in your story's third plot point? And that brings us to the end of this episode of Helping Writers Become Authors. I hope you'll stop by the site for a full transcript of this episode and to join in the conversation in the comments. Tune in for next week's episode, where we'll continue to explore all things writing and storytelling. If you'd like to support the podcast, it always means a ton when you take a moment to leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or Spotify. To stay updated on all the latest content I create for you, the best way is to join my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You'll also immediately gain access to lots of free resources, including my books, Crafting Unforgettable Characters and 5 Secrets of Story Structure. For real-time connection with me, more writing advice, and behind-the-scenes glimpses, follow me on Instagram at authorkmwyland. A heartfelt thank you to each one of you for your support and enthusiasm, and especially those of you who support my work on patreon.com/kmwyland. You help make my site, this podcast, and so many other resources available to writers everywhere. So until next week, keep writing, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep being true to your stories. Thank you for being part of helping writers become authors.